everyone, welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. Fiona here. This week's episode comes from Independence Live's TNT show. Host John Drummond had an interview with David Powell, who is an artist living in the Netherlands. He has actually got a huge Twitter presence where he's known as European Powell, and he has been taking a very, very keen interest in free ports and special economic zones. He and John are discussing what he thinks is happening and the reason why these special economic zones and free ports are being brought in. He may well be right. What's of interest to us is that the Scottish Green Freeports, the line we're getting from Holyrood is, don't worry, there's controls in place. These are completely different. None of that applies to us. Now, it may be that the accurate position is somewhere in the middle. It's really hard to tell with this one. So we're just going to play the conversation and let us know what you think. I'll also link at the bottom of the podcast to an article that Richard Murphy did on free ports, which I think is quite useful. And we have, of course, covered free ports in a couple of our previous shows, so I'll put the links to those at the bottom as well. So get ready to be horrified by European Powell on the TNT show.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host. David Powell, who's joining us tonight, will be talking about free ports and special enterprise zones. Now, you may not know precisely what these are, but we're going to take away all of the misconceptions that may have surrounded these tonight. Now, to our guest, David Powell. Thanks for joining us, David. How are you?
Yeah, hi, John. I'm good. I'm live from The Hague with you tonight.
Fantastic. How are things in The Hague tonight?
Cold and windy, and it's weather you don't know how to dress for it, you know?
We'll be talking, as I said in the intro, about free ports and special enterprise zones. Help us through this stuff now. Yeah. Is there a difference between free ports and SEZs? And what are they? And why are they?
Okay, so what are free ports and SEZs? SEZ stands for Special Economic Zone. You can also say Special Enterprise Zone. I guess if you think about what a port is, a port with a harbour that deals with freight transshipment. Freight comes into a port area, it's stored, it's processed before it's re-exported. UK free ports, however, are privately owned tax havens, whereas EU ports are publicly owned. So that's really a key difference. So when you see this word free in front of the port, it's a bit like free trade, free markets, free cities, free speech. Yep. It's kind of the opposite of free, actually. It's meant for a certain elite, more or less a libertarian elite, to introduce things like corporate governance. Now, a special economic zone is much bigger version of a free port. Now, if you think about the two Scottish free ports, Cromarty and Inverness, and the Firth of Forth, each of those zones are 45 kilometers in diameter. You will see that the size of the port, the actual port in the harbour, is really small compared to that surrounding area. That surrounding area is a special economic zone. So most of the business being set up there will be in that port. But what we see that happens is once the corporate power gets in, they start branching out. They start branching out into the rest of the surrounding towns, cities, villages, rural areas. And that's when it starts, especially with deregulated ports after Brexit, it starts getting very bad for local communities. So in a simpler way, we could say a special economic zone is a designated region that can house a free port, an airport, a town, entire cities under a privately governed authority. So think of an SEZ, Special Economic Zone, as a room within a room, a state within a state. If you get even smaller, a party within a party. So the UK is now like a kind of a big Russian doll. That is what special economic zones are. It's very appropriate. We call it a Russian doll, actually. So, imagine you take that doll's head off. Inside are all these small states. The point of small states is what people like Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak love to talk about. It's about moving away from big government. It's about reducing big government powers and handing them over to small states, so companies can effectively manage and govern in those small states. Brexit is the kind of cherry on top for that. So this is very interesting, but it can lead to, say, all kinds of terrible things that we associate with free ports, where in countries that are, democracy takes a back seat for economic success. So things like money laundering, private banking, arms and weapons trade, human trafficking, stolen art, all these kinds of nefarious, illicit activities.
Let's assume that the Freeport, there's two in Scotland, Cromarty and Forth. And let's assume that the Freeport in Forth area, which I think most people would understand fully, that 45 kilometre diameter area. Does that mean, for example, that whoever was running that enterprise zone could make up their own laws?
Yeah.
So they could say, for example, we don't want trade unions, we don't want health and safety laws. We find all of these things hugely restrictive. And by the way, we've decided to involve ourselves in areas which have a big negative impact on human relations generally across the world. There would be nothing that would allow the local community. Say, for example, half the citizens of Edinburgh were incensed at these plans. Mm-hmm. Let's assume they were real plans. Are you saying there's nothing these folks could do about it?
No, nothing. That's it. You're effectively allowing corporate governance into that area where they can make their own private laws within and beyond the reach of the host country's laws. That's the whole point of exit. That's the whole point of Brexit. You exit the obstacle and remove the obstacles of democracy to set up a private zone with its own laws. So they've been, they base this on, if you remember the Brexit chant of Singapore on Thames and Hong Kong. Well, those countries were, in the mid 1800s, they were colonized by the British. And during that time, I think it was either Singapore or Hong Kong, it was 82 free ports were set up. So they brought their own laws. They kickstarted the drug trade, just after the two opium wars. And they brought their own courts with them as well. So this was referred to as China's century of humiliation, right? So the economy boomed, but all kinds of things like democracy and workers' rights and protections and environmental protection, they were just out the window. So, when people like Truss and Sunak talk about admiring the work ethic of, those in Singapore, they're talking about modern day slavery. That's what they admire.
Well, at the same time, a lot of people in the audience tonight will have travelled through Changi Airport in Singapore and must be saying to themselves, well, my experience of Singapore wasn't at all like that.
Yeah.
All I could see around about me was growth and people prospering. And what's wrong with that?
It's what's behind the scenes that's wrong. Now, if you start looking into, say, specially made buildings like workers' dorms and things like this, they're tiny. They're really badly run. Again, you've got people who you won't see as mostly tourists in Singapore and things like this, because they'll be working in those areas that are also ring-fenced from any kind of public scrutiny.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like the glossy brochure version, but what's behind it is actually a total absence of democracy. It's a total absence of being able to vote. Things like this. It's unbelievable. And that's where Brexit, where they base their growth models on.
So let me get this right now. You're saying there's a big difference between the way free ports operate. Let's stick to free ports for a second. Sure. The way free ports operate in the EU compared to the way they could well work in the UK.
Yeah. Let me just...
And you reckon that's down to local control or the lack of it?
Yeah, relaxed laws means relaxed enforcement of laws. So, deregulation, which is the number one reason for Brexit, They can't just deregulate the entire country. They eventually will. They will eventually turn it into one big tax haven, but they have to start small. So that's where you have competing zones. There are, including the free ports, 86 special economic zones being set up. There's 48 in England, 18 special economic zones in Scotland, and 8 in Wales. I can also list the special economic zones in Scotland. I don't know if that helps people.
Yes, fire away. Let's know where they are.
So you've got obviously Inverness and Cromarty, Firth, and the Firth of Forth. So they're not yet operational, by the way. So this is interesting. Then we have, this is a bit of a list now. Creative Clyde, Glasgow, is for creative industries. This is all on the UK government's website. Prestwick, South Ayrshire for aerospace. West Lothian, Broxburn, food and drink manufacturing. West Lothian again with Eliburn, Livingston, food and drink manufacturing. Yeah. Dundee Port, Dundee Claverhouse, Leithport, Edinburgh, Nig, Highland, Hatston, Orkney, Scrabster, Highland, Arnesh.
This information is drawn from a UK website, is that right?
Yeah.
So the UK government is proposing that these be set up.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people watching and listening tonight will assume that needs the approval of the Scottish government. Is that the case or not?
Well, it's going through. The bidding for all these zones closed in 2021 and 2022. So all the contracts, they've already been made. So this is, if you think about, I've seen heavily redacted freedom of information letters with the public also demanding to know what the hell is going on. And I've seen videos of redacted documents, just black lines scrolling. It's very easy to get a hold of, but many of those freedom of information requests didn't even come back to people. Okay. So I think one of the main supporters was Kate Forbes in the SNP. Yeah, as far as I know, she sent a letter. There was a letter published where she's fully on board with the UK government and the implementation of free ports and special economic zones.
Oh, well, in that case, I'll extend an invitation to Kate Forbes to come on the show and tell us whether she agrees with what you just said or not. But let's just examine in more detail what these things are, because people will be, I suspect, alarmed to learn from you that there could well be established areas in their own country which will operate free of the laws that bind the rest of the country.
Yeah.
The reason that some people fought against devolution was because that's the very thing they didn't want to see happen.
Yeah.
Now what we've got is a form of devolution which doesn't require public approval.
Mm-hmm.
However, it seems to me that the controlling bodies on these entities must have some political representation.
Yeah, you would think, right? But like I said, I'm working with a number of researchers and also all across the UK, people like Jim Funnell from South Devon and Plymouth. For that Freeport there, we've got Tartan Tuesday, who's one of the main researchers. You can follow her on Twitter. She's just absolutely fantastic at getting, all this kind of information out of all those little hidden areas that are just, everything we research is available in the public domain.
Let's take a look at one of these places in particular. Let's take a look at Forth.
Yeah.
Who are the political representatives? You've got a chart somewhere. Who are the political representatives from Edinburgh, Falkirk, and elsewhere who serve on the governing body of the Forth? The political representative for the City of Edinburgh Council is Cammy Day.
Yeah.
There's also from Falkirk, there's somebody called Councillor Alan Nimmo.
Yeah.
And Fife Council is represented by Altony Craig.
Yeah.
These three people, as far as I know, are all members of the Labour Party.
Yeah, that's true.
So there's no representative from other parties on the board of this. Now, this strikes me as odd. Now, this board that we're looking at, these people are specifically on the board of the fourth arrangement, if I can call it that.
Yeah.
Well, that's really quite disturbing. That means that the Labour Party is not only fully behind this, but is actually fully supportive of it.
Yeah.
So that begs an obvious question. What would happen in the event of independence to these entities?
This is where it starts getting very complicated. Scottish independence, there is a problem because something called state aid. The UK, after Brexit, falls under WTO, World Trade Organization rules. And that means the UK is defaulted to those rules. It's no longer in the EU, which changes how state aid, which is public money, by the way, in the EU is distributed. So in the EU, it is illegal for governments to give state aid, that is public money, to companies of their choosing because it distorts markets and creates an unlevel playing field. The member states absolutely will not put up with that. Okay, so the problem is WTO rules are far more flexible, and it looks very likely that Brexit will effectively sabotage rejoining the EU if the government decides to give state aid under WTO rules to companies of their choosing, a little bit like the PPE crisis.
Right, so let me follow this through if I can. In the event that Scotland became independent and wished to rejoin the EU, this would be a severe impediment because the EU would find it impossible to accept Scottish membership.
Exactly.
If Scotland at that time contained this sort of state support.
Yeah. It's just not viable. It would, you can also go to the EU Commission's website, which is, I'll just find it, on rules of state aid to special economic zones. They have a whole page there dedicated to that, and they explain exactly what we've just been talking about, that you cannot allow markets to self-regulate in these zones. The difference between, first of all, they are ports in the EU. They are not free ports. They are ports because they are publicly owned. Free ports are privately owned. And the same with special economic zones. They have to be publicly administered in the EU. You can't have what the EU website that I'm looking at right now says, allowing Adam Smith's invisible hand to trust the markets to self-regulate. That is just completely disrupting the integrity of the member.
That's essentially the view that the EU came to, because the other problem I imagine that the EU discerned is it turns out to be a urinating competition, effectively, because you get one lot urinating on the other lot. You can see what's going to happen here. It would happen on a smaller scale across the UK, because every free port would then start to compete with every other free port.
Absolutely.
And the result of that will be it could be a drastic dropping of standards right across the board. Otherwise, how can you compete? I mean, you can't charge your customers more. So, so let me get this right. The EU will not accept our free ports because they're not publicly owned.
Yeah. On the 31st of December 2023, Jacob Rees-Mogg's REUL, Retained EU Law Bill, scrapped 600 EU-UK laws that affect three main areas. That is employment rights, food safety, and the environmental protection. So overnight, those laws were revoked. They're gone. In early January, the UK government produced an REUL, Retained EU Law report. One of the first things it says in that report is EU ports are publicly owned and unsuitable for the UK economy.
Yeah, okay. There's a fundamental reality, which is that the way the UK is constituted, because it doesn't have a written constitution, of course, but the way it's constituted in the broadest sense is that no government can bind its successor. So if government A, the current government, has decided this is a good idea, that is not binding on any successive government. Why would any commercial entity want to engage in this if they thought it could be abolished within
Yeah.
3 or 4 years.
Yeah. The other thing the REUL report mentions is that the free ports are future-proofed.
Well,
So
you can't do it. That's sophistry, because in the UK you cannot make anything future-proof because of the way the country is constituted.
well, that's what they're saying on the report.
No, it's common sense.
Yeah.
If a successor government cannot be bound by its predecessor, you cannot future-proof anything, whether it be free ports, enterprise zones. None of that could be safeguarded.
But yeah, this is where I think, the deregulation starts kicking in, because it's going to affect everything. It's going to affect sovereignty. It's going to affect Scottish sovereignty. It's going to affect
But
people.
my point though, David, is it can't. I mean, these entities are not sovereign states. So if a sovereign state is created round about them, then
Yeah.
that sovereignty will prevail. You can't future-proof. I mean, for example, let's say Scotland became independent tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
Then all of these enterprises should they not fit with that new state's view of what's important, these would all be in jeopardy. UK law would not apply.
Yeah.
Any of the safeguards that these organisations thought they had are worthless. I can imagine if I was running one of these free ports, I'd be spending an enormous amount of effort and energy, if not capital, to make sure that independence never happened.
Yeah. So this is really problematic. So the other thing that happens with those contracts we talked about that were the bidding for the zones, the next stage is something going on in Honduras now. And you might think, what has that got to do with Scotland? Well, a special economic zone, which are also known as private cities, was set up on the island of Honduras. Now, this is a little story I want to tell you. Basically put forward by a guy called Professor Paul Romer. And Professor Paul Romer, he's a lecturer at US Stanford University. Rishi Sunak's mentor was at Stanford was Professor Paul Romer, and he delivered lectures on a return to colonialism, and by using the framework of the SEZ Charter City. So Paul Romer went ahead and tried to set one up in Honduras, and basically the Honduran Supreme Court shut it down because it violated the people's sovereignty and land. Okay, but the company that tried this, that then Paul Romer then quit, and then another company came in called Prospera. Prospera now are suing the government under investor state dispute settlement for $11 billion, which is something like 2/3 of the GDP of Honduras. Okay, because they've done something called a 50-year contract, which basically enslaves Honduras, to the ownership of the company. So now it's a big kind of furore around it, of course.
Yeah.
But the Prospera, if you go and click on the website of Prospera, you've got some key names there who are they're basically governance consultancies who are building the cities of tomorrow. But and they're very proud to tell you that they're libertarians, and that they believe in removing the constraints of capital accumulation, and by privatizing a country.
Yeah.
So if you think about these SEZs all competing with one another, if you go right back to the beginning, the first thing that will happen is you're going to have job displacement. So that's when people from poorer, or failing regions or communities, they will basically migrate to the new Freeport zone looking for jobs. Well, the thing that's going to happen there is first they leave behind a community to just fall even further into ruin. And but then they enter into a zone where workers' rights, I just told you about the REUL bill, they're scrapped. Now, the RMT and the TUC both have issued statements on their websites that they absolutely oppose free ports and special economic zones for exactly these reasons.
Well, let's come back to this a little while, if we may. There's am I right in thinking there's a Freeport already up and running in the north of England?
Yeah, in Teesside, right?
In Teesside. How's that working out?
Yeah, that's a massive scandal. I mean, if you read Private Eye, you will see that. Okay, bit of background here. Each Freeport, so that is 12 Freeports in the UK, get seed capital, again, public money from the government of 25 million. Okay, so times that by 12, that's 300 million. Teesside Freeport has already spent £500 million plus £500 million of taxpayers' money on the Freeport. Okay, so that's what is that 16, 20 times more than this original sum. And apparently 90% of those profits are going to Mayor Houchen's buddies. What's his name? Is it Chris Corney and Musgrove? So they set up a thing where the private sector and the public sector, it's completely unbalanced. It's weighted heavily in the favor of the private sector. So 90%. And I believe they've made something like £124 million last year. And apparently, according to Private Eye, none of those profits of the 10% owed to the public sector have materialized. So, that is Sunak's flagship Brexit Freeport. And look what it's happening. I on Twitter, I will say, well, rinse and repeat this across, all the other Freeports. And not just that the special economic zones, each special economic zone gets 80 million per zone. So times that by 74, it's 5.92 billion. Right now, I'm also looking at economists and who are writing about these vast sums of money, and they say, well, actually, and people like Professor Alf Baird, it's not enough for long-term sustainability. It is enough for boom and bust to make the profits, and then just move to another zone.
It just seems to be intrinsically self-defeating.
Yeah.
I mean, if you had one zone per state, that might just scrape by. But as soon as you create more than, say, 2 or 3, all you do is you end up, as I said earlier, in this urinating contest.
Yeah.
It's bound to work that way. I can't see, I mean, if I'm running a Freeport and you're running a Freeport, the only way I can compete with you, I suspect, is to drop my standards.
Yeah.
Thereby lowering my cost base.
Yeah.
And therefore generating a profit that's attractive to people who want to invest in my Freeport.
Right.
You then can only reciprocate, I imagine, by doing likewise.
Yeah.
So eventually we'll have a race to the bottom when it comes to workers' rights, when it comes to environmental safeguards. And I assume that all of this is entirely possible because of Brexit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll take you up on that. Again, on the government's website, because they've got, a lot of information there about their Freeport levelling up bonanza. The Freeports that Margaret Thatcher set up in the 80s, 90s, I think there were 11. The only reason they failed, and it's on the government's website, is because they had to comply with EU regulations. So fast forward to today, Brexit Britain can now turbocharge this kind of deregulation frenzy and the amount of zones. That's why they have so many all over the UK. And the other thing I want people to know about, I wrote an article about the former First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford. Yeah. He signed off. I read the parliamentary transcripts in Welsh Parliament, and he was, there were questions about, Westminster asking in inverted commas, to set up 2 Freeports in Wales. I think Ynys Môn, Anglesey, and then also Port Talbot. He did have questions, and questions were put to him, and his answers were, it looked okay, maybe we shouldn't do this. But in the end, he went off and signed off 2 Welsh Freeports with Sunak and another central figure who no one seems to know. Well, I know a lot about him, Shankar Singham. Shankar Singham is known, he's a US trade lawyer, and he is known as the brains behind Brexit. So he was effectively a middleman. Shankar Singham is somebody he works for various governance consultancies. And again, private governance consultancies who are providing what he calls the deregulatory framework, so that companies can come into the zone and set up and not worry about things like paying taxes, supporting and sustaining the local community, workers' rights, all those things. They don't think about this. It's about extracting as many resources and making as much profit you can, and then just leaving. Go up to the other funny thing though is because you normally hear of things like tax havens in the Cayman Islands, right, and Bermuda and places like this. Well, I think the reverse can happen now. You can onshore your wealth within those zones. That's that whole thing about private banking that can take place in the Freeport or the SEZ. So did we talk about the Fourth Ports? Isn't it they have 6 or 7 Freeports under their umbrella, which is Tilbury, Thames Freeport, Fife. There's a couple of others. Otter Ports Limited is the parent company of Forth Ports. Otter Ports Limited, the managing director of that is Lord Smith of Kelvin in Scotland. Guess where that's registered? It's registered in the Cayman Islands. Lord Smith of Kelvin did not declare this in the Register of Interests, and there is a letter where somebody made a complaint to the government about this, and it's been published online.
But anyway, it looks like the Scottish Government has agreed to significant Labour representation on the Freeport arrangements in Scotland. Suffice to say that there are very few political, perhaps they're all political appointees, but members of political parties there. Most of these folks, I gather, are business people. I think the reality is that the Scottish Government has signed up for these, and that's why I think it would be terribly important for Kate Forbes perhaps to come on the show and explain the logic behind this, because on the face of it, based upon what David has been telling us, there might not be a universal welcome for these. And if there's a dearth of information, then it's unlikely that there'll be any enthusiasm at all if people don't know what the heck they're paying for. That's never a good look, I have to say.
I mean, those freeports, they will be maintained at great public cost. I think we're all aware that there are many councils now facing bankruptcy all over the UK. I wonder about councils in Scotland, actually.
Not so much because the Scottish Government supports the councils.
Yeah, but are there any trouble with the councils there in Scotland?
Well, there's always a debate between local government and central government. In this case, I'm talking about Edinburgh and the amount of funding. So if the Treasury reduces the funding for the Scottish Government, obviously, in every sense, the Scottish Government has to reduce its funding for the entities that it funds. It's just a straightforward piece of arithmetic. And there's always a debate about what's not being cut and what is being cut. But my understanding is that the Scottish Government, for example, has maintained its support against the people affected by the bedroom tax, and that continues. But that's because it made decisions that don't align with the priorities and values of Westminster. And I think my sense of it is that there's a lot of people at Westminster who find that shocking and unacceptable and would rather it stopped. And it looks to me as if the Labour Party is not going to address any of these things because it seems to have developed a policy stream that chimes very closely with that which we presently experience with the Conservatives. So we have to wait and see what's going to happen there, I imagine. But people in the audience tonight might be thinking, oh, this really upsets me, having listened to what David has to say. What can they do about it, David?
Yeah, the only thing I've been the last year speaking at public meetings in South Devon and Plymouth. That was hosted by George Monbiot from The Guardian. I did a talk with a really great anti-Freeports SEZ group in Liverpool, Radical Pensioners Group, and they were absolutely livid that Labour Steve Rotherham, the mayor there, had signed off on these free ports. They were just crazy. It was really incredible. They were absolutely shocked and outraged at, their rights being taken away, about Liverpool. I mean, Liverpool's really traditionally hardcore left, but this is an absolute betrayal. So they're going nuts. I did also a talk with a church group in London. So all kinds of different, facets of communities all over the UK. The most talks I've done actually are in Scotland. So this weekend I was speaking at Inverness Anti-Free Ports campaign group. That was sad because I had my flight was cancelled the day before, and I really wanted to see Inverness, so I'm hoping they'll want me back. But again, the talk, exactly the kind of things we are talking about, people in the audience completely unaware that basically, their sovereignty is being commodified, their councils are being bankrupted. Who is going to run these councils? Who is going to provide public services? Well, it's going to be the corporation. Now, I get a lot of flack for suggesting anything remotely to do with what we call charter cities and private cities. But I don't see, I just work with the kind of parallels I make, which are from, these zones where democracy is just shoved aside for corporations to step in and make their own profits, or, again, this kind of return to colonialism. And I think after China, the British now are turning this back onto their own citizens. It's no coincidence that protest is being slammed, right? You can't hold up a blank piece of paper anymore without getting arrested.
Yeah. So you reckon what people should do is write to their MPs or MSPs and say, look, we just don't like the sound of this now. We know a bit more about it. We'd like you to tell us and reassure us that what we've heard might not come to pass. I mean, people are entitled to these reassurances, it seems to me. If we're talking about, particularly if we're talking about spending public money.
Yeah. By all means, write to your MPs and councillors, but every single meeting I've attended, the only councillors who turned up were the Green Party.
Yeah.
The Labour councillors, the Tories, they didn't even bother turning up. Okay. Yeah. So how does that look to the locals? They're supposed to represent us.
Yeah.
And there was, I told you we've got some incredible big accounts following us now on Twitter. People, I did an interview with Carol Vorderman a couple of weeks ago. Furious.
Was this on LBC or was it?
Yeah, it was on LBC. Yeah. It was a very brief intro, but the feeling, the absolute anger, outrage, it's all there, and it's great to be on this show and actually dig in a lot more into what is going on. So I want to thank you again for that.
We've had loads and loads of questions. You've addressed some of them. Obviously, people are concerned about private contractors servicing free ports, like managing agents who might ring fence contracts and maintenance and all that sort of stuff. And people are worried about, what might happen here. But there's also a strong sense that people feel that, well, this is part of the British state and its decline. After independence, there'll be a clean slate, and all of these things will be wiped out. I heard your comparison with Honduras. And I know that it is possible to go to international courts and seek some sort of settlement there. I'm not sure that would apply when there's a change of state, because then the new state could say, well, that went before. We're not bound in any way, shape or form to an undemocratic entity that pre-existed us. Yeah. And we, like all sovereign states, assume the right to either agree or disagree with what went before. Otherwise, there'd be no point in changing the state.
Did you also know there's another thing we didn't mention yet, compulsory purchase orders? We didn't talk about that, right? So last year, on Michael Gove's Levelling Up section on the UK government website, he added another section on compulsory purchase orders. And this is horrific. So compulsory purchase orders apply to business, agriculture, and residential properties. And they even say on the website, I'm going to paraphrase, we understand that it's upsetting and worrying for you to lose your business, your property, residential or otherwise. But this is in the pursuit of leveling up. So this is what I think is happening, why I call it, engineered insolvency of the councils. Gove is also selling off all those public assets. He's also invited a team of what he calls emergency managers to step in places like Birmingham to start, I think, installing corporations to take over. They will say they are rescuing democracy from its failures. So the only way to go is via the private sector. That's very, very worrying. Compulsory purchase orders.
Yeah, I mean, it all sounds like increased centralization.
Yeah.
At a time when people are crying out for decentralization.
Yeah.
I mean, more and more people seem to accept the view they prefer local decisions taken locally. Yeah.
You have to be very careful, because this is also the kind of ammunition for this whole small state coming up. It's like a kind of smoke and mirrors subterfuge to say, well, yeah, we hear the locals, and this is what happened in Honduras, but there was local outrage, and it took the Supreme Court to undo this. But like I said, they are now being sued for $11 billion. This is the whole thing of libertarianism. Libertarianism meaning freedom of the individual, freedom to liberty, freedom from taxes and things like this. Yeah, it's very, very dangerous. So when, this freedom thing, it applies to a certain amount of people, and that's basically the 1%.
But that doesn't apply in the EU. And the reason it doesn't apply in the EU, as I understand it, is because the 1% are not in charge of these free ports, or these ports. They're publicly owned.
Yeah.
Right. So if there is a solution to this, then the solution is that if it has to happen in Scotland, for whatever reason that's opaque right now, the way to obviate the problems that we've been discussing is for those entities to be publicly controlled.
Yeah, absolutely. But that you're basically mirroring the whole point of Brexit is to get rid of all of that.
I understand, yeah.
And to introduce corporate governance and corporate powers in small states. That's the way you break it down into little pieces. You turn the UK into a Russian doll.
So if you had a magic wand, if you could wave it tomorrow morning and create something that you would much prefer to see, what would you like to create?
Back in the EU again. I would like for all kinds of reasons, also about Ukraine, also about protecting people from the kind of predatory capitalists out there who are trying to take everything from the public sector, who are demonizing people for whatever race or whatever, identity they are, whatever their jobs are, this kind of hunting people down and punishing them. When basically the opposite of that is corporate welfare, that using public money to actually crush the public sector. Yeah. That is, libertarians, they talk about that public services at the end of the day are just small potatoes to them. Their goal is something they refer to as countrypreneurship, where you've got a nation as your target for your libertarian dream. So I want that to be swept away. I want all the think tanks to be swept away. The IEA, the ERG, Policy Exchange. I mean, many of those think tanks are charities. They are funded by the taxpayer, you see. So I want all that gone. I want Labour. If Labour are going to go back to the left, please do. They're not doing that after Blair. They just, Thatcher said Tony Blair was her greatest achievement in life. So someone like Starmer now, he's just carrying the baton on with the SEZs and the Freeports. None of it is good. I say Scottish independence, Welsh independence, join the EU.
You also said it would be very difficult. It would be impossible for that to happen.
That is my magic wand.
Yeah, of course. So the magic wand would, the preceding step in your sweep of the magic wand would be the abolition of all the Freeports.
Yeah.
And that would enable the EU to look upon any prospective re-entry more.
They just have to regulate them in line with the EU's ports.
Yeah.
But we're not seeing any good faith from either of all of our so-called representative parties.
Two quick things I'd like to raise with you. Gregor is asking about your homepage. He said it's mainly artwork related to Freeports, but I guess you would prefer to direct people to your Twitter account rather than...
Yeah, absolutely. I'm an artist. I lecture in contemporary art. That is also, I mean, you cannot be an artist today without being political. All art is political. It was the reason I started diving into this was because I was denied a vote on Brexit. I'm living in The Hague in Holland, and a couple of my friends were also denied a vote on Brexit. So it just made me really angry. I can't actually sell my work into the UK anymore because I would need a second accountant, which is just prohibitively expensive. So, I just began peeling back the wall, peeling back the layers and looking into what it was. And it's just horrific.
Danny Darling was on our show and you pointed out that Brexit happened mainly because of middle-class people in the southeast. That was his analysis based on the numbers as opposed to the emotional responses about, it's all these folks in the north of England. He says it's categorically not true.
Yeah. I believe it's tied up with what I've been researching at exit strategies from the 1960s that were birthed, in the wake and in hostile response to Roosevelt's New Deal in 1932, which lasted for 30, 40 years, egalitarian governance, prosperous healthcare, all that kind of stuff, sharing the wealth, managed capitalism. I think it's very true that all the think tanks, they hated this. They hated the idea of what they call the theft of their property. So they started to develop these exit strategies. So Brexit is a kind of kind of ideology made flesh, and here we are. I mean, the IEA it's 70 years it's been running. The Institute of Economic Affairs, set up by a battery chicken farmer, Anthony Fisher. And he was advised by Hayek to never disclose the partisan agenda to the public because they would be outraged and then they would lose their charity status. But that's, in a way, for me, that all links up to this Russian doll thing, the state within a state, the room within a room, the party within a party. We all know those think tanks are pushing for libertarian exit. That's what Brexit is. That's where it comes from. Further back, goes back to colonialism, East India Company in 1600. And Singapore mid 1800s, and they're just reincarnating it for today.
It's crazy. You talked about the IEA. I think you said has charitable status.
Yeah,
and somebody questioned that recently, and the Charities Commission came back and said, "No, your grounds for challenging it, IEA status, are political, and we don't deal in political things." Our experience, I set up an entity called the Constitutional Commission.
Yeah.
And one complaint during the 2014 referendum from the Conservative Party that this was political resulted in the Charities Commission writing to me saying, is this true? And I thought, well, hold on a second. What is this all about? We explained when we applied for charitable status that it was non-political. It was about constitutions, which is about state building. It's not about political party building. But one complaint was sufficient to have them clutching their pearls. And yet here we have a situation where the IEA is unaffected. But it's a strange old thing. I'm deeply grateful to you, David, for giving up your time. I appreciate it a lot. As I said, we plan to be educational and informative and at the same time be entertaining. And I think you've done all of that for us tonight. And I greatly appreciate it.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you agree that it's a really, really concerning situation, and I'm sure it's one we'll be returning to. But do let us know what you think. We'll be back again next week with next week's episode of Scottish Independence Podcasts. Catch you later. Bye now.